Welcome to Lincoln Log, where we speak with leading historians and other officials about their stories, research, and wisdom. Expand your knowledge and indulge your curiosity here on Lincoln Log. This podcast is produced by the Abraham Lincoln Association, aiding and promoting Abraham Lincoln's life and legacy. Founded in 1908, the ALA remains the nation's oldest and largest Lincoln organization. Learn more at abrahamlincolnassociation.org. Greetings. I am your host, Joshua Claybourn, and I'm pleased to welcome David Reynolds to our Lincoln Log podcast. David is a wonderful historian who is the author or editor of 15 books, many with an emphasis on the Civil War era or the era's leading figures. He has been awarded the Bancroft Prize, the Christian Goss Award, the Ambassador Book Award, the Gustavus Myers Award, and was a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award. He is a regular reviewer for the New York Times Book Review. His most recent book, Abraham Lincoln in His Times, has turned quite a bit of heads and will no doubt be a prominent stocking stuffer this holiday weekend. David, thank you for joining the podcast.
Great to be here, Joshua. Thank you.
You're obviously an expert on the Civil War and Lincoln. So what sticks out to you as something you learned during writing this book?
I was quite surprised how radically open Lincoln was to his contemporary culture, because in one of the very best books on Lincoln by David Reynolds, biography, Donald said he entered the presidency the least prepared of all of our presidents. And I found, and that's kind of based on the fact that, okay, he was a self-made man and all of that, and he had less than 1 year of education, which is true. But I read a passage from Emerson who said, of all the great heroes in American history, Lincoln is the one who crosses the entire range of cultural experience from the very highest to the lowest. And it's true. I mean, on the one hand, Lincoln could recite Shakespeare by the page, not to impress people, but just to express certain emotions that he had. He could attend opera and all of that, but he also went all the way down to kind of dirty humor and, bawdy jokes and that kind of thing, and this sort of grotesque frontier humor. And then he liked everything kind of in the middle too. He loved sentimental songs, for example. His favorite song was called 20 Years Ago, and it's quite sentimental and everything like that. So yeah, he really did bridge all levels of culture, which is partly why he had such a compassionate vision for people of different backgrounds and different cultural levels. He was by no means a snob. He was neither John Quincy Adams, who knew 7 languages and read the Bible in a different language every year, on the one hand, nor was he Andrew Jackson, who was a populist who, it was rumored, had only read one book in his life beside the Bible, and that was a novel called The Vicar of Wakefield. So, but Lincoln really had this democratic sensibility.
Yeah,
that kind of surprised me.
Yeah, and that's no doubt part of the reason probably no American has been written about more than Abraham Lincoln, because of his ability to sort of transcend all different categories of folks. What, for somebody who's been written about as much as Abraham Lincoln has, what do you feel like really sets your biography apart? When a reader picks it up, what do you hope that they walk away with that sets your contribution to this body apart?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, I offer what I call a cultural biography. We are all strongly shaped by our cultural environment, both our immediate, local culture, but also as that local culture intersects with elements of the larger culture, the larger American culture. And There have been so many books about Lincoln, wonderful books, but you can read book after book and not meet somebody like Edgar Allan Poe, whose poetry he would recite, or even hear very much about his very popular most popular humorist, Petroleum Nasby, for example, or about Artemus Ward. You occasionally will hear about him, but he was another popular humorist who was so important. Or even about Walt Whitman. Occasionally Whitman is mentioned because Whitman witnessed him on the streets in Washington, but there's so many deep connections between Walt Whitman and Lincoln and so forth, and kind of on and on and on. The whole contemporary culture in which he swam, so to speak, is quite often left out. So I want to use his life as a kind of skeleton of the narrative, to be sure, but then around that skeleton I interweave, almost like a tapestry or something, all these different cultural strands that influenced him and that he in turn fed back and influenced himself. So
Yeah, I think that's great. I think too often people, when they set out to write a biography, don't contextualize the subject within the culture that they're in. So I deeply appreciate that aspect of your work. A lot of what I research and write on focuses on Lincoln's youth in Indiana. So I'm eager to get your perspective on his youth, how it influenced him, and maybe even that culture, and how that affected him as he went on to become president.
Yeah, well, obviously he's born in Kentucky and then moves at a fairly young age to Indiana. Both of their environments were extremely important on shaping him. In Kentucky, his parents broke off from the Baptist church and from the regular Baptist church and joined 19 people who formed an anti-slavery Baptist sect almost, which was rather unusual. So, and Lincoln said, I never recall a time in which I did not hate slavery. So from a very young age, he did. Also, they were in an area of Kentucky where nearly half of the working population were enslaved people. So we don't have direct record of his response immediately, but he must have witnessed slavery around him. And he did say that one of the reasons why his parents removed to Indiana was slavery. The other was the indeterminate real estate situation in Kentucky, where there was a phenomenon called layering, which means that a lot of these lands, huge territories, had been bought up initially by Eastern investors, and then Kentucky settlers came later and bought parcels, and then somebody else bought their parcel. But the original Eastern landlord was not paid and everything. So it became a very mushy real estate situation.
Yeah.
So they went to Indiana, where the land was more government apportioned, and it was a much more solid kind of real estate situation. Although Indiana at the time was really the wild frontier. It was a very, it was probably even more so than Kentucky at that particular time. It was a new state, and the population density was quite low, and it was kind of it was very much of a direct confrontation and immersion in nature in a very raw form. And I talk about the way in which what's known as the post-human. The post-human is just anything outside of us, outside of humanity, that influences us. Right now, we're all living by the post-human because a thing, COVID, at this particular moment, is greatly shaping the way we behave. So in a way, we're living a post-human existence right now. And back then, and at other moments, there could be a hurricane, Katrina, that could be the post-human thing, or it could be an earthquake. I used to live in California, and earthquake could be something outside. But he was always surrounded by raw nature, and it kind of I think produced in him an awareness of the earth and a closeness to nature, and it kind of feeds into even the way he talks in the Gettysburg Address about, our founders conceiving on this continent, the earth, the continent, and then so that democracy will not perish from the earth, from the earth, that kind of thing. There's and a lot of his jokes were in a way post-human. Almost all his jokes involved animals or things or that kind of, and mixed them up with human beings and so forth. So I think that was really shaped, by his Indiana culture. He only had fragmentary schooling, but back then, another thing that kind of bothers me a little bit is I think Tom Lincoln, his father, gets a little bit too short shrift. Now, it is true.
You read my mind, because that was going to be one of my next questions. What your take on Thomas Lincoln was?
Yeah.
He's seen as such a negative influence, but many modern historians, I think, are starting to reassess that view. So I was, curious how you would categorize him.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the case against him. Okay. Yeah. I mean, he could barely read, not very literate. He may at one point have gotten mad at Lincoln, perhaps for reading instead of doing the work around the house or something like that. But generally, the direct reports that you read by people who knew Tom Lincoln a long time ago, they were recorded later on by Herndon, and he went back to them. He really gets quite high marks as a very good worker, as kind of an upright man, and also someone who is kind of genial. Actually, he was a little bit like Lincoln himself, because he's a great storyteller and a humorist, but he could also sink into the hypo, the blues. He could also have the blues, kind of like Lincoln himself. Actually, later on did that. But in general, for example, it was a culture of a lot of drinking, alcoholism, and Tom Lincoln would have his toddy now and then, but that he really didn't drink, nor did Lincoln himself. And he was a fairly good provider, actually. And the fact that Lincoln once said, "I used to be a slave," about his childhood. Well, when you're living on the frontier, it's understood that everybody, all the children, will help out with the subsistence lifestyle that largely was the frontier. So for Lincoln to be farmed out to do these odd jobs, and for other people, and also whatever, for his father and everything, that was not unusual at all. Right. And so he actually looked back in his childhood to one of his closest friends, a lawyer. He said, "Actually, my childhood was quite joyous. We never felt that pinched or anything." And the reason they didn't feel that pinched is that even though Indiana in 1819 underwent a severe recession, almost a depression, actually subsistence living made sense. People did relatively well because they were kind of living off the land, so to speak. So they didn't mind that, and a lot of their trade was by barter. So in a way, they didn't really get involved too much in the financial downturn of that time. So in general, I think I'm not trying to be rosy about the father, but I think that he has gotten a short shrift. Is that your impression in general too, or is that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I certainly fall on the more positive overall influence, and to the extent it was negative, I agree with you that it's negative in keeping with the times, right? I don't think for his times and his place on the frontier, I don't foresee Thomas Lincoln being out of bounds from a negative sense. And I think he obviously was a hard worker. He had a good work ethic. I just think, what he viewed as the skills necessary to get ahead in life were different than what Abraham Lincoln saw and what Abraham Lincoln wanted out of life. And
so, I think what happens is that when they moved to Illinois, and then Tom Lincoln lives in a different part of Illinois, I think at that point there is a kind of distancing,
right?
Because Lincoln at that point really does have kind of a change, or a new kind of dedication to a different kind of advance. As a politician, as a lawyer, kind of entering more the traditional middle class lifestyle, whereas Tom Lincoln really never leaves that kind of older lifestyle. So I think I think at that point there is kind of a separation. Yeah.
Right. How would you describe Lincoln's law career for our listeners?
Well, I would say that he was an intuitive lawyer. He only had a small handful of books that he read, but he read them over and over again. And he was a very good case lawyer. He worked case by case. His law partner, one of his law partners, Herndon, said that he was not a learned lawyer. He didn't study the law that much, but the small amount of books that he did study, he studied them very well, and he was very, very good in court. He was very good in court, and to me, it also broadened his horizon immensely, because back then we didn't have someone in real estate law and someone in ambulance chasing or whatever, or this kind of law, that kind of law. He would go around the law circuit because these small towns in Illinois didn't have lawyers. So he and a bunch of other lawyers would go from town to town to town and handle the cases. But it could be a local argument of who owns pigs. It could be, he did a lot of debt law, bankruptcy law. He did homicides. He did a lot of divorce law. He did a lot of spousal abuse law. He would do law against railroads and for railroads and everything. To me, it was a very, very, very broadening kind of experience. And he learned in the law, he said, I like to study my opponent's case just as strong, his reasoning, just as much as my own reasoning. And to me, that was a real producer of an elasticity of thinking.
Yeah.
If you can enter into the other person's reasoning, and he would say that, I would think about that. And so he could really anticipate a lot of the arguments in court. So, yeah.
Right. What would you say is your favorite Lincoln speech, and why?
I hate to be boring, but the Gettysburg Address, because what he does there is he boils down the American experience in such a beautiful, eloquent, and pithy, short way. And every word is carefully chosen. The language is very rhythmic. It's poetic. And he brings human equality to the very, very center of what America means. And he does it in his first sentence. And then he also defines democracy: of the people, for the people, and by the people. That's how he ends up. And now, not all of the Gettysburg Address is original. The fourscore thing had been used not only in the Bible, but by previous politicians. Of the people, for the people, and so forth. There have been 12 different versions of that previously. Daniel Webster, Theodore Parker, and so forth. Although he straightens it out and makes it much more rhythmic. And even New Birth of Freedom had been used that phrase at least twice by previous. But I think it was Picasso who said, "I'm the greatest borrower that there is." So sometimes great people will borrow. I mean, Moby Dick came right out of Mocha Dick, the legend of which was very popular in the magazine. The Scarlet Letter, 5 years before, there was a popular novel about a woman who wore a scarlet letter. I mean, a lot of great people will borrow,
Right.
and so he borrows, but a great genius or a great orator will know how to then transform these borrowings and put them together in some kind of very expressive way. And he does that there. I love that speech. I love the second inaugural. I love Peoria, 1854. I love Cooper Union for a different reason. that's more, I just love the logic of that. And he goes to
Right.
the founding fathers, and he kind of almost does a head count of and how did they really feel about slavery, even some of those who owned enslaved or had enslaved people. Well, the majority of them actually, he says in that speech, envisaged the eventual extinction of slavery.
Right.
So to me, the history and logic of that is just wonderful. Yeah.
Cooper Union, I think, is interesting in this, that from it seems to me a lot of historians overlooked it or didn't give it quite enough attention until I think Harold Holzer really shined a light on it recently.
I was so happy that Harold wrote that book.
Yeah.
Really, really happy. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Because
I agree. Well, what's your assessment of Lincoln as a commander in chief?
he entered, unlike Jefferson Davis, who had been an officer and also in the Mexican War and everything, and West Point. His only experience, Lincoln's only experience, was briefly in the Black Hawk War, in
Right.
1832. Didn't have much experience, and he read up on some books of military theory and so forth, and he stumbled through a lot of rather poor generals. McClellan was he became dependent on McClellan early on because McClellan was really a good inspirer, and he really inspired troops, soldiers. McClellan did, and he was very smart. I think he'd been number 2 or 3 in his class at West Point. Very smart, very charismatic. Trouble is, he really was dilatory when he got to and a little bit cautious when he got to the battlefield, and he
Right.
always overestimated the enemy's forces and so forth. And finally, after Antietam, Lincoln got kind of angry that, as he had gotten angry at Meade after Gettysburg, for not chasing Lee and doing him off. He just fired him at that point. And then Lincoln kind of stumbles through various people, Burnside, who had the disaster at Fredericksburg,
Right.
and then Hooker, who had Chancellorsville. And finally, he takes notice of what's happening with Grant, with Vicksburg and all of that. And then, of course, Meade does stop Lee at Gettysburg, so that's good. And then he has Vicksburg. So I think what's best about him, Lincoln, as commander-in-chief, is that unlike certain presidents, he doesn't just fire people, let's say, because they're not loyal to him. In fact, very few of his generals agreed with him politically. Even Sherman, even Grant said, "I'm not a Lincoln man," and McClellan, of course, was complete racist and just anyway. So, but he said, I'm not looking for personal loyalty. I just want to win battles. So he's wise enough to kind of sift through the generals and take a harder, in the middle of the war, a harder vision of what war should be.
Right.
And he says, so far we've done squirt guns filled with rose water, in our on the battlefield. We really need to be a little more like what Francis Lieber, the military theorist, says, which is a hard war can be a just war. That, in a way, if you get the war done with, then that's more of a just war than just extending it out forever and everything like that.
Yeah, I think James McPherson touches on that when he addresses the strategy of unconditional surrender, that really highlights Lincoln wanted peace, but he knew it could only really be achieved through a hard war. And I think that helped shape some of the aggressive tactics we saw with Grant and Sherman and Sheridan and this unconditional approach. But I also like that you highlight he was a constant learner. I think he had a certain humility about that and would read military strategy, spent a lot of time in the telegraph office, sending and receiving military dispatches, just very much a student. As you point out, he didn't have a strong military background himself necessarily. That didn't stop him from learning as much as he could about it. another of many admirable traits about Lincoln, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And he actually learned the code of the telegraph, and he spent so many hours in and it's the first time that warfare, in a sense, could be experienced in kind of real time, because the telegraph is the first time it had been used extensively in a major war. So yeah,
right.
He got all these dispatches from the front, and he would make intuitive decisions and so forth. Yeah.
We mentioned at the top about your desire and effort to really place Lincoln in the cultural context, and I too love that aspect of your book. And so one of the new chapters that I really like in your book is titled "Blondin, Barnum, and Behoys," 3 Bs, and each of those were a 19th century cultural phenomenon that reveals something fresh about Lincoln. Could you summarize those influences and what drove you to write that chapter?
Sure, yeah. Blondin speaks to Lincoln's public pose as kind of a moderate, a centrist, because he felt the worst thing he could do in a divided time is to inflame either side, either extreme. And so Blondin was a very skillful French acrobat who came to America and walked across Niagara Falls many times. He did it backward, forward, on stilts. He did it pushing a wheelbarrow. He did it with a man on his back, and no net. And during the 1860 campaign, cartoonists picked up on the comparison between Blondin and Lincoln, and they portrayed him as as Blondin walking across the tightrope, because he was known. I mean, he was known as kind of a centrist. He wasn't on the more radical wing, such as or perceived radical wing, such as Chase or Seward. And it wasn't on the perceived moderate wing like Bates. He was sort of much more moderate. And then when he was in office, actually, he himself compared himself to Blondin several times. And when a couple of groups came to him and said, one from Boston and one from the West, said, "Can't you make this a more explicitly anti-slavery war from the beginning?" And he said, if Blondin were pushing a wheelbarrow across the Niagara Falls, and the wheelbarrow was filled with the American future, would you tell the Blondin to step left, step right, jump up, jump down, or whatever? No, you would let him keep right on his course, his centrist course. He said, you know what? If I say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, we're going to lose one of the border states. We're going to lose, Kentucky or, Missouri or Maryland or Tennessee. And he said, if we lose Kentucky, we might as well give in right now. Right. He had to remain Blondin. So that covers Blondin. Barnum refers to the culture of sensationalism. P.T. Barnum was not involved in the circus at that time. He exhibited oddities or things that were considered oddities at that time. Whoever was the tallest, the fattest, the this, the that, the thinnest, he would exhibit and people would pay to come see these exhibits. One was the Fiji mermaid, who he advertised in posters as this beautiful half-nude woman in fish. Turns out it was a monkey's torso sewed up to a salmon's tail and suspended in water with a little blonde wig on there. But anyway, but it was that kind of thing. And anything kind of little curious or odd. It was the culture of what I call the est factor, the tallest and fattest, that kind of thing, or the weirdest. And Lincoln, in a way, liked to run as the ugliest. He said, I'm the ugliest guy around. I don't think he was that ugly, but people, in a way, played up his sort of homely stature and face and everything. And in a way, he put that on exhibit. Even when he was on his train stops, whistle stops, he would kind of make fun of his ugliness. He loved to tell a joke about it, or jokes about his own homeliness and so forth. but also he was put on display as the rail splitter because just before the 1860 convention, someone brought in rails that he had split a long time ago. And for a long time, Lincoln had been a middle-class lawyer. He had once been a rail splitter and all of that, a frontiersman, but when a long-lost relative came in with these rails, suddenly everyone said, ha ha, here we are. And Abe, in a way, this gets to my title, Abe. He didn't like that name, Abe, but he said, I could only have been elected on the name of Honest Abe, Old Abe, Uncle Abe, or Abe, the Illinois rail splitter. The common man. He was sold. He was put on display everywhere during the 1860 convention as the rolled up sleeves woodsman, with an axe and, so forth. And that really catapulted him to being beloved by the average person. And among the average people that he wanted to cultivate were the Bohys. The Bohys was just that era's name for the working class person, the day laborer, the butcher, just kind of the everyday Joe, so to speak. And when Walt Whitman 5 years earlier had written Leaves of Grass, his famous poem, he had presented himself as one of the roughs. He's one of the roughs, turbulent, drinking, breeding, eating. Now, Walt Whitman was none of those things. He was a middle-class journalist. He was not a rough. He didn't drink. He didn't breed. He wasn't turbulent. He was a very common. But he presented himself by name, and his reviewers, the first three reviewers said, "This is our Bohoi poet. This is our." They actually used that word. It was also called the Bowery Boy, and it became a national figure because it began on the streets of New York. But pretty soon, the Illinois Sucker. That was the nickname for the young rough person, the sucker, named after a fish, or the Indiana Hoosier, the Hoosier, and the Wolverine was the Wisconsin. Every state had its own version of the Bohoi. And when Lincoln ran in 1860, he was known as both the Hoosier and the Sucker and the Illinois rail splitter and Abe, and they all kind of ran together. So then this group of Bohois organized around him and called themselves the Wide Awakes, and they dressed up and they in oilskin coats and they paraded at night. Well, scary now with torches. We don't like to think about that, but with torches and everything. But it was all for Abe and for freedom, liberty, all.
Abraham Lincoln presided over one of the most divided times in America. How would he confront a lot of the divisions that we see today?
Well, we know how he would act because he did live in a even more divided time than we do. I mean, 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War. Some from disease, but a lot just in battle, and they were killing each other, so they were at each other's throats. But he never once demonized Southern people. He didn't demonize the opposition or even his opponents in the North. In fact, some of his Republican supporters got a little mad because he didn't more actively campaign in the midterms for Republicans. He would do anything he could to avoid division. So if he were alive today, he would do anything even if he had a strong base or anything, he wouldn't play to a particular base. He stood for principle, and a lot of Northerners stood behind him for that principle. The principle was that slavery was evil, slavery was wrong, was a moral wrong, and also secession was wrong too, and we must restore the Union. We must restore it without slavery, and that's what he pushed for. But he never. So if he were alive today, he would not pander to any particular group.
One of the main issues we face today, and obviously the central issue for Lincoln's time, is race relations, and so it is interesting to see so many historians, especially the battle over monuments and that sort of thing, where we start to see Lincoln brought up occasionally in those discussions. So I'd be interested to hear you summarize how Lincoln's views on the subject of race evolved, but then also how you view him, or how we should view him today on that subject.
Well, unfortunately, some historians cherry pick,
Right.
particularly his early speeches, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where he says, I've never supported the vote for Black people. I've never asked for them to serve on juries or that kind of thing. He does it in kind of grocery list fashion because he was debating against Stephen Douglas, who was like super racist.
Right.
Explicitly. I mean, Douglas just said, ours should be a white man's government forever. I mean, that's all. And at that moment, Lincoln found himself in Illinois competing for office against this racist who actually won the election. Douglas won, although Lincoln won the popular vote, but he won the district. It was like gerrymandered district. Anyway, so Douglas won that election. But Illinois had what Frederick Douglass called the worst black law of any law in the nation in 1853. If you were a free African American and you weren't even living in Illinois in the first place, and if you entered the state, after 10 days, you'd have to pay a stiff fine or face jail time, or you'd be forcibly taken out of the state. I mean, it was a very bad situation. So I kind of read his early comments on race in that light. But personally, in Springfield, within 3 blocks of his on Jackson Street, there lived 21 African-American people, and he became quite close to some of them. William Fleurville, his barber, who he knew for a long time, he became very, very close to, helped him out in court for free, pro bono, helped him get land and everything. And they became quite affectionate to each other. A guy named Johnson was another African-American who he got close to. William Donegan also. So personally, he was close, but publicly he had to be a little cautious. And even in the Civil War, because he was aware of the border states and losing them, possibly losing, he had to be a little bit careful about his statements about race. But when he finally brought African-American soldiers into the war, about 180,000 of them, he said they really, he was so impressed by their performance. I don't know if you've seen the movie Glory, but I mean,
Oh yeah, it's a great movie.
I think it could be my favorite Civil War movie. But anyway, he was really inspired by their side, and he really honestly thought we might not have been able to win this war without the self-sacrifice of these African-American soldiers. And he met with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass at first was wary of him because he wasn't rapid on slavery. But eventually, when Douglass met with him, he said, Lincoln is actually the least prejudiced white person I've met. And Sojourner Truth, the African American feminist, visited him, and she had a very similar response to him. And Martin Delany, who frankly was beyond Black Lives Matters. I mean, he was like a black nationalist. I mean, he was really radical, and he met with Lincoln and felt quite close to Lincoln. And Lincoln gave him the highest appointment in the Army, Major of Infantry, for an African American.
Right.
But then the war stopped, and so he actually didn't serve. But when Delany heard that Lincoln had been assassinated, he literally cried. He cried like a baby for about 45 minutes. And he wanted to form a statue for Lincoln. But interesting, the statue had to be, as Delany said, very African. It was going to be of an African woman shedding tears into an urn. And this was going to be paid for, and the entire statue was going to be paid for by previously enslaved people who would each contribute a penny. Now, that never took place, but I think those people today who object to what actually happened, there was an African-American funded statue that came out in 1876, of course, that shows Lincoln and then an enslaved person that's rising up. And some people wanted to tear down that statue. because they say, oh, the enslaved person doesn't have enough agency in this statute. Look at what the most radical Martin Delaney said. The woman is kind of kneeling and kind of looking up, and that's exactly the way African Americans felt. So yeah,
Right.
I very much object to our objections, to current objections to that particular statute.
Right. We always like to end this program with a question of what's your favorite Lincoln anecdote or story? And so I want to give you the opportunity to answer that question as well.
Oh, that's a funny one. That is such a funny one. I like two kind of anecdotes that relate to food. When he was on the law circuit, when he was setting, they really ate in these very seedy inns, and they stayed with bed bugs and everything like that. It was, terrible places. And so he sat down, and in one place he said, well, in the absence of dinner, I think I'll dive into this cabbage, And I thought that was, and he reportedly said, told the waitress, if this is tea, will you please bring me some coffee? But if this is coffee, will you please bring me some tea? I thought that was a good one too. That made me laugh.
That is a good one.
But there are so many anecdotes, that are really fun.
Right. Well, David, I really appreciate you joining us, and I know our readers, our listeners, I should say, no doubt enjoyed this, and I encourage all of them to go pick up your book. It seems to be every year we have some Lincoln book that seems to take the focus during the holiday book season, and I think yours has solidified its place in that. So best wishes as you sell it and as you continue on your book tour. I'm confident it'll be a large success, and I appreciate your addition to the body of Lincoln works.
Joshua, thank you very much, and I'd like all your listeners to pick up Abe and hopefully enjoy it as much as you have. And thanks for having me. You were a great interviewer.
Thank you for listening to Lincoln Log. You can subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. And if you like this podcast, please consider rating it on iTunes and leaving a review. This helps other people find the show.